So we're starting off with ecological niche and species interaction, and we're going to do this in two parts. Firstly, looking at the idea of what a niche actually is, and then coming back to do these specific interactions. So a niche is a word you may or may not have heard, but it has a huge range of definitions depending on the context. For our purpose, a niche is basically an organism's specific role or purpose within a group of organisms within that ecosystem, and it has to obviously interact with all the other elements of that ecosystem, biotic and abiotic. Now, an ecological niche is how an organism actually fits into that ecosystem and the way it functions, while a habitat might be kind of a way to explain an address. A niche is a way to describe the profession or the career of this organism, and it's basically the total of its interactions have to be taken into consideration here. So the when, the where, the how, the what, the how, where it sleeps, it poops, it eats, it's whatever it is. Okay, so the full range of resources it uses have to come into play. What it might produce, how it does all of its movements, what conditions it tolerates, all these things. So it's an incredibly complex and layered idea when we're talking about it in ecology. Now, the niche of an organism it occupies will depend on the conditions that are available. Makes sense. So there's a little bit of flexibility for some organisms with regard to the tolerance ranges, but outside of that range, survival just might actually not be possible. So this might be in relation to sunlight intensity, pH, salinity of soil or water or temperature or anything like that. So while we can survive between this section and this section, actually we would rather live here. So if two separate species occupy exactly the same niche in an ecosystem, so essentially they're practicing the exact same profession in the same way, in the same place, then eventually they're going to outcompete one another until only one of them remains in that niche. Now, the other organism population must make a compromise, okay? They're going to compete and one of them is probably going to lose. And that means they're going to make that compromise with regard to some element of the way they live. And it might be where, it might be what they eat, whatever it is, so that it can differentiate itself from that other species. And this is known as competitive exclusion. And this is going to be covered in a lot more detail later on. But know that species can have overlapping niches. They can overlap in some areas, but they cannot have identical niches. Okay, so in this situation here, this organism, G, it's sharing a lot of different elements with all these other organisms, but it's that line part in the middle there where it is actually unique, where it's not competing for any other resources or whatever it is. Now, bird species with the same insect food source in the same habitat in the same tree, they might differentiate themselves by doing different parts of the tree, higher up, lower down, to avoid competition in their actual physical space. So that's one nice example of it. Now, ecology is riddled with situations where we can discuss it all in theory, but the reality is quite different because of the complexities involved with living amongst other populations of organisms and the abiotic factors. So a fundamental niche is the idea where there's an ideal niche an organism would occupy if given the widest set of potential opportunities to live in, not taking into consideration any other relationships or how anyone else around them lives, right? There's no competition, there's no predators, whatever it is, right? They want to be able to live in this whole idea here. This is where we want. However, a realized niche is the actual real life scenario where it lives, and that's going to take into account all those relationships. So yeah, it might want to live here, it might want to do its thing here, but actually this is where the overlap begins. And so it's kind of pushed into this idea here. Maybe we're talking a resource where they want to eat this amount of food, but that food's going to overlap with this other species. They're going to be out-competed by this species, and therefore it's going to push them into this more smaller niche. Maybe they have to give up that food source because some other organism is taking it. So we have to keep thinking about this idea for compromising versus not compromising. And a classic example of this, is on a rocky shore ecosystem. There's barnacles. They need to learn to live with other species. They're not mobile. They're just going to sit on that rock, basically. And some species can live across the entire rock face, but when they're presented with a competitor for space and resource, their physical niche narrows. So given the opportunity, yeah, they're going to spread out. But hey, this stronger competitor is going to come in and take a lot of their space there. Now, the realized niche is obviously going to be much more narrow, okay? And the difference between the two comes from an organism's ability to fully exploit the resources within that habitat. So other organisms restrict what they can and can't use. And if two species do overlap a little bit, and we've seen this picture before, then they're competing for the same resource, and it might affect the distribution, so how they are spread out of that resource or that organism. It'd be like if we let you walk into the tuck shop first and you says choose whatever you want with no regard to any other student having something at lunchtime. That's your fundamental niche. But if you actually went because you were late to class and there's a massive lineup or whatever it is, that's your realized niche. Not everything is left. You have to take what's left, and maybe you're not a very strong competitor because you were late from class. So in this image here with the multiple species, that fundamental niche would be that whole big circle. This is where it kind of wants to live and can tolerate and all those things, but actually it's kind of competing with all of these other species. So it's this diagonal shading part where its realized niche actually is.